Hi, welcome to the Hurricane Utah Adult Religion class, sponsored by the Hurricane Utah North Stake of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Mike Parker, and since 2008, it's been my privilege to be the instructor for this class. The Hurricane Utah Adult Religion class meets on Thursday evenings between September and May to discuss the scriptures, teachings, and history of the restored Church of Jesus Christ. If you live in or are visiting the Hurricane St. George area, I'd love to have you join us. Time and location are available on the class website. There's a link to that in the show notes just below this video. Also on the class website, you can download my notes, which includes footnotes documenting my sources, this PowerPoint presentation, and handouts that I distribute in class. Please note that this YouTube channel and the class website are not official sites of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Hurricane Utah North Stake, or any other church unit or department. I alone am responsible for the content on these sites. What you're about to see is a recording of my notes for one of the lessons. If you enjoy this video, please click the like button and share it with a friend. And please feel free to subscribe if you'd like to be notified when new content is posted to this channel. My friends, the gospel of Jesus Christ is true. Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, and the authority and keys that he held are now vested in the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And most importantly, Jesus Christ is the Son of God and the Savior of the world. I hope you enjoy this lesson. In this lesson, I'm going to interrupt our usual reading schedule and talk about the Book of Abraham, specifically how we got it and why it's important. We'll start with the discovery of some ancient Egyptian manuscripts. In 1798, General Napoleon Bonaparte of France invaded Egypt. When his expedition returned to Europe, the scientists and artists he had taken with him published about what they saw there. This fueled a wave of Egyptomania among Europeans in the early 19th century. The intense demand for Egyptian artifacts spurred enterprising men like Antonio Leibolo. Leibolo was an Italian who had served in Napoleon's army. After Napoleon lost control of northern Italy in 1814, Leibolo moved to Egypt. There, the diplomat and antiquities collector, Bernardino Drovetti, employed him to oversee excavations in Upper Egypt. Sometime between 1817 and 1821, Leibolo excavated 11 well-preserved mummies and some documents written on papyrus from a pit tomb near the ancient city of Thebes. Leibolo shipped these artifacts to Italy to be consigned for sale. After Leibolo's death around 1830, they were sent to New York. There, in 1833, they were purchased by Michael H. Chandler, an American entrepreneur. Chandler went on an exhibition tour of the northeastern United States, charging people to see the mummies and occasionally selling items from the collection. Michael Chandler came to Kirtland, Ohio in early July 1835. There he sold what remained of the collection, 4 mummies, several rolls of papyri, and some loose papyrus sheets, to a group of Latter-day Saints who purchased them for $2,400 on behalf of Joseph Smith and the church. Within days of obtaining the collection, the prophet Joseph announced that, quote, one of the rolls of papyri contained the writings of Abraham, another the writings of Joseph of Egypt, unquote. Various entries in Joseph's journal indicate that he spent portions of the next 6 months working on a translation of the Abraham material. Between July and November-December 1835, Joseph and several scribes created at least 16 manuscripts related to the Book of Abraham translation project, totaling about 120 written pages. Today, they are collectively referred to as the Kirtland Egyptian Papers, abbreviated KEP. The Kirtland Egyptian Papers contain two types of documents. Three manuscripts produced in 1835 contain most of chapters 1 and 2 of the Book of Abraham. 10 of the KEP documents appear to be an attempt to create an Egyptian lexicon of some sort. The most extensive of these is a bound book containing 34 inscribed pages titled Grammar and Alphabet of the Egyptian Language. Some of these documents, including the grammar and alphabet, have Egyptian symbols in the left-hand margin and a proposed English translation to the right. While the Book of Abraham was published in Joseph Smith's lifetime, more on that in a moment, the rest of the Kirtland Egyptian Papers were not completed, published, or explained. The manuscripts were placed among the papers of the church historian's office in Utah and soon forgotten, only to be rediscovered in the 1960s. Scholars today are still debating their meaning and connection to the Book of Abraham. The text of the Book of Abraham was first published in Nauvoo in the spring of 1842 as a series of 3 articles in the Times and Seasons, the church's semi-monthly newspaper. In February 1843, Joseph Smith indicated in the Times and Seasons that more of the Book of Abraham would be published, but nothing more ever appeared in print, and so far, no manuscripts with additional text from the Book of Abraham have been discovered. The Book of Abraham comprises 5 chapters of text and 3 facsimiles. Chapter 1 details Abraham's early life in the idolatrous Chaldean city of Ur, where he was offered as a sacrifice to Egyptian gods, but was saved at the last moment by an angel of Jehovah. This chapter also includes a brief folk history of the origins of Egypt. Chapter 2 describes Abraham's flight from Ur to the land of Canaan and from there to Egypt. It also includes the Lord's first covenant with Abraham. In chapter 3, Abraham related a vision that he received through an Urim and Thummim about the nature of the cosmos, which was a metaphor for the graded nature of intelligences or spirits. This chapter concludes with a description of God's premortal council in heaven. Chapters 4 and 5 contain an account of the creation, similar to the one found in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and Moses chapters 2 and 3. A facsimile is an exact copy or reproduction of written material. The Book of Abraham contains copies of 3 illustrations from the Egyptian papyri in Joseph Smith's collection, along with explanations of the symbols and how they relate to the text of the Book of Abraham. Facsimile 1 is the only one of 3 facsimiles that is explicitly mentioned in the text of the Book of Abraham. It contains 12 numbered figures, which are described in the accompanying explanation. According to the explanation, it represents Abraham fastened upon an altar, about to be sacrificed by an idolatrous priest. Above Abraham is the angel of the Lord, sent by Jehovah to rescue him. Facsimile 2 contains symbols that relate to the Egyptian cosmology described in Abraham chapter 3. The facsimile itself is not mentioned in the Book of Abraham text, and its purpose and connection to the text are not explained. There are 23 numbered items in facsimile 2. 7 of them are identified in the explanation. 13, figures 8 through 21, are said to have not yet been revealed, and 2, figures 22 and 23, are not mentioned in the explanation at all. Facsimile 3 represents, quote, Abraham sitting upon Pharaoh's throne by the politeness of the king, reasoning him upon the principles of astronomy, unquote. This facsimile includes 6 numbered figures. Neither this facsimile nor the scene it depicts are mentioned in the Book of Abraham. The facsimiles themselves are intriguing for several reasons. First, they are the only illustrations canonized in Latter-day Saint scriptures. Second, the illustrations and the explanations attached to them contain no teachings that are a part of Latter-day Saint doctrine. Third, the explanations attached to the facsimiles are not translations in the usual sense of that word. In 1835, when Joseph Smith was working on his Egyptian papyri, Egyptology was in its infancy. Only a few scholars in the world could translate the materials Joseph had, and none of them lived in the United States. It's only since that time that we've come to understand the original purpose and meaning of the facsimiles, something I'll get to later in this lesson. What became of Joseph Smith's collection of papyri? After Joseph Smith was assassinated in 1844, his mother, Lucy Mack Smith, took possession of the mummies and the Egyptian manuscripts. She exhibited them for money, which she used to support her modest living. 2 weeks after Lucy's death in 1856, Emma Smith Bideman and her second husband, Louis Bideman, sold the collection to a man named Abel Combs. It was long believed that Combs sold the entire collection to the St. Louis Museum, which transferred them to the Woods Museum in Chicago, and that all the materials were lost when the Woods Museum was destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Indeed, much of the papyri and all of the mummies probably were lost in that disaster. It was later discovered that Combs had given portions of the papyri to his nurse, Charlotte Weaver Huntsman. In 1847, Edward Husser, widower of Huntsman's daughter, sold the materials to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. When they acquired the papyri, the curators of the Metropolitan Museum knew that they were connected to Joseph Smith and Mormonism, but they did not inform the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints of their existence. In 1966, the Metropolitan Museum's curator of the Department of Egyptian Art, working through a mediator, approached the leaders of the church to see if they wanted the papyri. After some negotiation, the collection was presented to the church in November 1967. The portions of Joseph Smith's collection that were returned to the church are collectively referred to as the Joseph Smith Papyri, abbreviated JSP. The JSP consists of 11 manuscript fragments. The documents now in the church's possession are copies of the Book of the Dead, an ancient Egyptian funerary text. Copies of the Book of the Dead were buried with deceased Egyptians. They contained magic spells intended to assist the individual's journey through the underworld, where he or she would be resurrected and judged, and then take their place in heaven among the gods. 3 of the documents, Joseph Smith Papyrus 10, 11, and 1, were part of a single long scroll that belonged to an Egyptian priest named Hor, who died between 238 and circa 153 BC. This text is called a Book of Breathing. JSP 1 includes the illustration that is Facsimile 1. This is the only document recovered from the Metropolitan Museum that can be directly connected to the Book of Abraham. The original of Facsimile 3 was not recovered, but it also belonged to the scroll prepared for Hor, the Egyptian priest. The remaining 8 documents in the Joseph Smith Papyri are fragments of 2 other Egyptian books of the dead belonging to Sheyemen and Nefer-Irnub, both of whom died between circa 300 and 100 BC. Joseph Smith had at least one additional papyrus scroll that has not been recovered. We know this because there is a copy of some hieratic characters in the Kirtland Egyptian papers with the name of a 4th individual named Amenhotep. The original of Facsimile 2 has also not been recovered, but the hieroglyphics on the front indicate that it belonged to Shishak, a wealthy member of an Egyptian priestly family. This type of document is called a hypocephalus. More on that shortly. The Joseph Smith papyri were written during Egypt's Ptolemaic era, between 305 and 30 BC, when Macedonian Greeks ruled Egypt. Based on the recovered material and the eyewitness accounts of the collection during Joseph Smith's lifetime, we know that Joseph had at least 4 scrolls plus the hypocephalus, and that the scrolls themselves were quite long. The lengths of the scrolls on this slide are estimated at 10.5 feet, or 3.2 meters, but recent scholarship indicates they may have been as much as 4 times that length. If the scrolls' lengths were like other Egyptian books of the dead, then the material recovered from the Metropolitan Museum represents at most only 13% of the original papyri that Joseph Smith had in his possession. Critics have been attacking the Book of Abraham since the mid-1800s. The book's detractors consider it to be the strongest evidence that Joseph Smith could not translate ancient documents, and therefore he was not a prophet. These critics make 3 main arguments. First, they argue that we have Joseph Smith's Egyptian papyri, and they contain common Egyptian funerary documents. The papyri do not include the text of the Book of Abraham. Second, modern Egyptologists can translate the hieroglyphics in the Book of Abraham facsimiles, and Joseph Smith's explanations of the symbols don't match what the Egyptologists say they mean. Third, the Book of Abraham claims to have been written by Abraham's own hand upon papyrus, but the Joseph Smith papyri don't date to Abraham's time. They were written nearly 2,000 years later. In the remainder of this lesson, I'm going to examine and respond to each of these claims. My goal is to not only respond to these criticisms, but also to explain how the Joseph Smith papyri are related to the Book of Abraham. Criticism number 1, the Book of Abraham isn't on the Joseph Smith papyri. Latter-day Saints have responded to this in 3 ways. The first is to assert that Egyptologists are wrong and that Joseph Smith was right. In other words, the Book of Abraham is on the papyri recovered from the Metropolitan Museum, but Egyptologists haven't translated them correctly. However, this argument simply doesn't withstand scrutiny. Egyptology is a very narrow academic discipline, and there is a great deal of disagreement among Egyptologists about the meanings and messages of Egyptian culture and language. But we do know enough to rule out the possibility that the Book of Abraham is on the Joseph Smith papyri that were recovered in 1967. A second counter-argument is that the Book of Abraham was on some of the papyri that Joseph Smith had in his possession, but the translated text is not on the papyri recovered from the Metropolitan Museum. This is called the missing papyrus theory. I mentioned earlier that we have at most 13% of the Egyptian papyri that Joseph Smith had. It's possible that the Book of Abraham was on one of the scrolls in the other 87%, but it was lost when the Woods Museum burned down in 1871. The primary challenge to this theory is that all the material that we know Joseph Smith possessed appears to be Egyptian funerary documents. However, there is evidence that suggests that biblical stories and characters were used in Egyptian religious texts, so the missing papyrus theory does have some scholarly support. A third possibility is that the text of the Book of Abraham was not on any of the manuscripts that Joseph Smith had, but the manuscripts themselves inspired Joseph to ask the Lord and receive a revelation about Abraham and Egypt. This revelation was either from an ancient document written by Abraham and then lost, or a brand new revelation about Abraham that had not been previously written down. This is known as the catalyst theory, or revealed text theory. One reason this theory may be plausible is that Joseph Smith often used the term translation to describe revelations he received. For example, Doctrine and Covenants section 7 is a translation from parchment written and hid up by the Apostle John, but Joseph Smith never actually had that parchment in his possession. He received section 7 by revelation through the Nephite interpreters that he also used to translate the Book of Mormon. Likewise, Joseph referred to his revision of the Bible as a translation, even though he didn't work with ancient languages or have any manuscripts in his possession other than an English Bible. The entire project was carried out purely through inspiration. Another piece of evidence in support of this theory is that Warren Parrish, who served as one of Joseph's scribes in the translation process, wrote in 1838 that Joseph, quote, penned down the translation of the Egyptian hieroglyphics as he claimed to receive it by direct inspiration from heaven, unquote. The biggest weakness of this theory is that Joseph and his scribes believed that the Book of Abraham was on the papyri. It is possible, however, that they may have misunderstood the relationship between the text of the Book of Abraham and the Egyptian material. Since we don't believe that Joseph Smith was omniscient or all-knowing, this doesn't present too much of a challenge. So, which of these theories is the correct one? As I said, the first one doesn't have any merit. The second is certainly a possibility. There's a lot of material missing from the JSP, and the Book of Abraham could have been on it. Personally, I lean toward the catalyst theory, although I'm open to the missing papyrus theory. As with many unknowns in church history, though, I prefer to keep an open mind. In summary, the fact that we do not have an Egyptian manuscript with the Book of Abraham on it is not a significant challenge to its authenticity. Criticism number 2. Egyptologists' translations of the facsimiles don't match Joseph Smith's published explanations. To answer this criticism, we need to look at the original function and meaning of the illustrations and how they were repurposed to serve the Book of Abraham. As I mentioned earlier, the original purpose of the papyri owned by Joseph Smith was to provide written instructions for a deceased Egyptian on how to be resurrected, successfully pass through divine judgment, and then take his or her place in heaven among the gods. Facsimile 1, in its original context, is a lion couch scene. These types of scenes are common in Egyptian copies of the Book of the Dead. They usually represented the deceased person being embalmed on a table that had the features of a lion carved into it. The jackal-headed god Anubis, who was associated with mummification and the afterlife, stood nearby. The deceased person's Ba, the part of his soul that represents his character or personality, hovered overhead. Underneath the lion couch were 4 canopic jars that stored and preserved the deceased person's internal organs for use in the afterlife. The lids of the jars were carved representations of the sons of Horus, the gods who protected the organs. The lion couch scene portrayed in Facsimile 1 is a depiction of Hor, the Egyptian priest. This scene is unique in that it doesn't represent Hor being embalmed, but rather being resurrected by Anubis. Hor's Ba flutters nearby, returning to his body. Facsimile 1 has inconsistencies with other Egyptian lion couch scenes. In Facsimile 1, Anubis has a human head instead of a jackal's head, and Hor's Ba has a bird's head instead of a human head. The reason they're depicted this way is because the original manuscript probably had been damaged before Joseph Smith obtained it. The original, now called Joseph Smith Papyrus 1 or JSP 1, is missing Anubis's head and left hand along with the knife, Hor's torso and arms, and the top of the head of Hor's Ba. Joseph Smith or one of his scribes pasted JSP 1 onto a paper backing and penciled in what he thought should be in the lacuna, the missing portion. Reuben Hedlock, who prepared the woodcuts of the facsimiles for the printer, used the scribe's conjectural additions when he filled out the scene. What did the original vignette look like? We don't know for certain, but if it was like other lion couch scenes, Anubis had a jackal's head. There's been some debate over what was in Anubis's left hand in the original scene. However, at least 2 eyewitnesses from the Nauvoo period described the figure holding a knife, as we see in Headlock's woodcut. At some point, this vignette was repurposed and given new meaning for use with the Book of Abraham. Hor became Abraham on the altar. Anubis became the priest of Elkanah, who was attempting to sacrifice Abraham. And Hor's Ba became the angel of the Lord who appeared to save Abraham. In a moment, I'll talk about who gave it this new context and why. Just because Joseph Smith's explanation of facsimile 1 doesn't match the translations made by Egyptologists doesn't mean Joseph got everything wrong. In fact, there are several depictions in the facsimiles that he got exactly right, in a time when no one knew what they represented. For example, Joseph's explanation of the crocodile was, quote, the idolatrous god of Pharaoh, unquote. In its original context, the crocodile was the Egyptian god Sobek. The Egyptian pyramid texts praise the pharaoh as the living incarnation of Sobek. There is also a lion couch scene in the Egyptian Laden Papyrus 1-384 with the phrase, let Abraham who, written in Greek just below the couch. This papyrus is particularly important because it dates to the same period as the Joseph Smith papyri, the 3rd or 2nd century BC, and it was discovered at Thebes, the same city where the JSP were unburied. This demonstrates that a lion couch scene referring to Abraham is right at home in the time and place where facsimile 1 came from. Facsimile 3, in its original context, is a throne scene. In the Book of the Dead, the throne scene depicted the deceased individual being judged and exalted. In this example, from a Book of the Dead belonging to a scribe named Hunefer, Anubis led Hunefer into the hall of 2 truths, toward the balance or scales of judgment. Here, Hunefer's heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, which represents truth. If his heart wasn't pure, Ammit, the devourer of the dead, stood by, ready to eat it, in which case Hunefer would not be allowed to proceed, and he would be subject to the second death, the Egyptian version of hell. Thoth stood to the right of the balances, holding a pen and palette to record the outcome of the weighing. The scene continues to the right. Hunefer's heart was found to be true, so he would live forever as one of the gods. The falcon-headed god Horus conducted him to the throne of Osiris, the god of the dead, the afterlife, and resurrection. Behind Osiris stood his sisters, Isis and Nephthys. In front of Osiris's throne was a large water lily with the 4 sons of Horus standing on it. Facsimile 3, in its original context, is a throne scene that depicts Hor, the same individual who was resurrected in facsimile 1. Both facsimiles were originally part of the same scroll. Hor was being ushered into the presence of Osiris by Ma'at, the goddess of truth, and by Anubis. Isis stood behind Osiris. Their names are attested in the hieroglyphics above their heads. This vignette was also repurposed for use with the Book of Abraham. In its new context, Abraham was seated on Pharaoh's throne, with Pharaoh standing behind him. Facsimile 2, in its original context, is a hypocephalus that belonged to a wealthy man named Shishak. His name is attested in hieroglyphics in the panel marked as figure 8. The Greek word hypokephalos means under the head. An Egyptian hypocephalus was a round disc made of papyrus, wood, bronze, or other material that was placed under the head of a mummy. It contained a spell that would cause a flame to appear under the head to provide protection and warmth for the body until it could be resurrected. Around 100 examples of hypocephaly have been discovered. Most of them have the same stock themes in 8 panels. Their round shape, a universal symbol of completeness, represents the pupil of an eye, the sun, human life, and reproduction. We don't have the original Hypocephalus from Joseph Smith's collection. All we have is a drawing of it in the Kirtland Egyptian papers, made in early 1842. Based on this drawing, we know the original Hypocephalus was missing some portions. Comparing this to other hypocephali, it appears that whoever reconstructed it for publication in the Times and Seasons got many things right, including the placement of Ra, the sun god, in the upper right-hand panel. The hieroglyphics in the lacunae around the outside edge were not, however, reconstructed correctly. One of Joseph Smith's scribes inserted hieratic characters in their place instead. As he did in facsimile 1, Joseph Smith translated some of the figures in facsimile 2 correctly. His explanation for figure 3 was, quote, God sitting upon his throne, clothed with power and authority, with a crown of eternal light upon his head, unquote. This matches the original representation of Ra, the sun god, on his solar boat with a sun disk over his head. Joseph's explanation for figure 6 is, quote, this earth in its 4 quarters, unquote. The 4 figures in that panel are the sons of Horus, who were the protectors of the 4 cardinal points, north, east, south, and west. So why do the Book of Abraham's explanations for most of the symbols in the facsimiles differ from their original meanings? The most likely explanation is that these illustrations were originally Egyptian funerary documents, but someone later attached them to the Book of Abraham and gave them a new context, purpose, and meaning. It's possible that the person who recontextualized them was an ancient Jewish Egyptian scribe who wrote or copied the Book of Abraham. It's also possible that Joseph Smith himself adapted these illustrations for the Book of Abraham text. In summary, Latter-day Saint scholars acknowledge that most of Joseph Smith's explanations of the facsimiles don't match the translations of Egyptologists. Symbols and icons are fluid, though, and can be recycled and given new meanings. That's exactly what happened with the 3 facsimiles in the Book of Abraham. Criticism number 3. The Joseph Smith papyri are too recent to have been written by the prophet Abraham. The Egyptian papyri recovered from the Metropolitan Museum were written between 300 BC and 100 BC. Book of Abraham manuscript C, composed in the summer of 1835, starts with the heading, quote, translation of the Book of Abraham written by his own hand upon papyrus and found in the catacombs of Egypt, unquote. The first publication of the Book of Abraham in the Times and Seasons in 1842 expanded on the original heading, quote, a translation of some ancient records that have fallen into our hands from the catacombs of Egypt, purporting to be the writings of Abraham while he was in Egypt, called the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand upon papyrus, unquote. The use of the word purporting seems to indicate that Joseph and his associates weren't entirely certain that the documents were, in fact, written by Abraham himself. Stephen Smoot, a Latter-day Saint scholar of Egyptian languages and literature, explained, quote, if by his own hand upon papyrus was part of the ancient title of the Book of Abraham, as some have suggested, then there is no reason to take it to mean anything more than authorship, that is to say, by Abraham. If it is a modern reflection on the beliefs of Joseph Smith, or those who worked with him on the translation of the Book of Abraham, then all it tells is what these early brethren assumed about the nature of the Book of Abraham, not what the Book of Abraham says about itself, unquote. Critics of the text of the Book of Abraham prefer to focus on the Egyptian papyri and ignore the English text of the Book of Abraham. That text, however, had to come from somewhere, and it's an impressive document. Many details in the Book of Abraham, including an attempt to sacrifice Abraham when he was young and Abraham teaching astronomy to the Egyptians, are not found in the Bible, but are found in other ancient religious texts that Joseph Smith could not have known about or had access to. Beyond those ancient connections, the Book of Abraham is important to Latter-day Saint doctrine because of its unique teachings. It includes Abraham's account of how he desired to have the priesthood, despite the idolatry and wickedness that was all around him, and the connections between that priesthood and the Abrahamic covenant. It is one of the only revelations, and certainly the most explicit revelation, about the nature of premortal life and the council in heaven. We are blessed to have the Book of Abraham. It's a small book, but it is a work of infinite importance. The concepts found within its pages are of ancient origin and teach us truths not found in any other book of Scripture. That concludes this lesson. If you enjoyed it, please click the thumbs up button and leave a comment below. Please subscribe if you'd like to be notified when new lessons are posted to this channel, and visit www.huarc.org to download these notes and this slideshow. In the next lesson, we'll examine the life of Abraham and the covenant he made with God. The reading is Abraham chapters 1 and 2 and Genesis 12 through 23. See you next time.